Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual briefing on multilateral arms control after the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, how to involve China, Russia, and other nuclear armed states in the nuclear disarmament enterprise. My name is Daryl Kimball. I'm the Executive Director of the Independent Non-Governmental Arms Control Association, and we're very glad to have you with us here today for a discussion about one of the most important issues that you are not hearing about at the moment. It was only a little more than a month ago that the last remaining U.S.-Russian arms control treaty expired, New START, which creates the possibility that the United States and Russia could increase the number of deployed strategic nuclear weapons for the first time in more than 35 years. President Trump, as you'll recall, declined to take up a proposal from Russian President Vladimir Putin to continue to respect the central limits of the New START treaty for 1 year to provide time to negotiate a new bilateral arms control agreement of some kind. Instead, President Trump, along with his State Department advisors, declared that he would pursue a, quote, new era of arms control, unquote, involving an as yet undefined multilateral approach that also includes China, which is, of course, in the midst of its own significant buildup of its strategic nuclear arsenal. And then at the same time, the U.S. officials have also alleged that China conducted a secret nuclear test explosion on June 22nd, 2020, which is a violation of the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, if it is true. That is a treaty that the United States, China, Russia, and over 180 other countries have signed that obliges them not to engage in any experiments that produce self-sustaining nuclear chain reactions. And President Trump, as we heard last fall, has threatened to resume U.S. nuclear testing for the first time since 1992, quote, on an equal basis. So we have some major questions and major challenges ahead regarding the architecture of bilateral nuclear arms control, of multilateral nonproliferation and disarmament that has helped reduce nuclear dangers for decades. And the administration argues that there needs to be an evolution of arms control as new challenges emerge. And the Arms Control Association would agree. And unfortunately, thus far, the administration has not put forward how it proposes to engage with other nuclear armed countries, including China, or what they propose should be negotiated, what kinds of limits, what kinds of arrangements. Just this morning, U.S. Undersecretary of State Tom DiNanno, who's responsible for international security and arms control, testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I can say that he did not provide any clarity about these questions. He did not provide any more detail about what the United States proposes to do. But when President Trump does eventually meet with China's President Xi Jinping on his delayed summit, which was supposed to take place next month, it will be a chance for the two men to discuss these and other issues. So with that as backdrop, we have gathered three distinguished experts to discuss the nuclear policy challenges that lay before us, what multilateral arms control options could and should be pursued, what kinds of approaches and discussions have taken place in the past. And we have with us three experts, as I said, beginning with Mallory Stewart, who's the former Assistant Secretary of State under the Biden administration, who was responsible for engaging in talks with Chinese counterparts and with Russian counterparts. We have one of the leading experts on China's nuclear policy, Tong Zhao from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who's joining us today from Malaysia, I believe it is. So we hope his connection remains good. And last but not least, we'll have Thomas Countryman, who was Assistant Secretary of State for Nonproliferation and International Security at the State Department, He's also the chairman of the board of directors of the Arms Control Association. But first, we'll start with Mallory Stewart. Mallory, thanks for being with us and for laying out your thoughts about these challenges and how we can productively move forward. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here, Daryl, and to the ACA for asking me to be on this distinguished panel. I was asked to talk about what the US has tried to do in the past to engage China on nuclear matters. And I'll focus on specifically the P5 process, our limited trilateral efforts, and our bilateral efforts that I'm specifically aware of because I have been involved in many of those. So starting with the P5, which, as many of you know, was originally proposed by the UK at the CD in 2008, and then first started operating with shifting between each of the members of the P5 as of September 2009, cycling through those members and continue to meet up and through this particular administration. In the P5 context, primarily focusing on confidence building measures, certainly relationships of other treaties to Article 6 requirements, such as the CWC, the BWC, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, CTBT. Also in P5 context, we've discussed Iran and DPRK nuclear risks. We've discussed nuclear material and export controls. There was a verification working group developed. We worked together on definitions and even had a product developed, the agreed glossary, expanding on the common definitions between the P5 with respect to nuclear issues. In January of 2022, the P5 agreed upon the reaffirmation of the Reagan-Gorbachev statement that nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, which was a good reaffirmation in 2022. And of course, we realized subsequently nuclear saber rattling developed as the Ukraine war launched shortly thereafter. In the P5 context, we've primarily focused on sharing nuclear policies with the US, UK, and France being more forward-leaning necessarily in that arena, Russia providing some nuclear policies as well, encouraging China to share its nuclear policies. And questions have been asked in that context as to the details of the no first use policy that China has frequently touted. How does that relate to launch on warning? How does it relate to huge conventional attacks? Where would it actually come into play in scenarios in which the Chinese government feels it's facing existential risks, even if nuclear weapons were not on first use? And really in the P5 context, the US and the P3 have tried to lead with a certain amount of transparency, tried to lead with a certain amount of clarity, answering questions about nuclear policies, and really trying to engage more broadly on how we work to reduce misunderstanding, miscalculation, and unintentional escalation. And so the confidence building mechanisms discussed in that arena really aimed at that objective. Certainly on the trilateral front, there's been less activity. Was reminded to address the proposal in 2020 during the first administration to engage the US, Russia, and China that the Trump administration put forward. It was not accepted and it didn't move forward, but it was an effort to actually have some trilateral discussions. There was some efforts between the US and Russia in that context in the first Trump administration, but nothing successful on risk reduction. And then moving into sort of bilateral with China on the specific arenas that I'm aware of, starting with the Obama administration certainly engaging actively on risk reduction, maybe not directly related to nuclear, but having a space security dialogue active and ongoing, chemical and biological weapons dialogues, again, trying to reduce the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation. There was also risk reduction engagements during Obama, but the most recent one I want to talk about was the one the Biden administration held in November of 2023. And that engagement, which was the first true nuclear risk reduction engagement in several years, helped kick off some mill-to-mill engagements that then proceeded throughout the Biden administration. The emphasis on of that risk reduction engagement, of course, was the need for communication and engagement to prevent the misunderstanding that we had directly seen resulting from the balloon incident, the Chinese observation balloon that crossed U.S. territory. That was one of the incidents we mentioned, a need for preventing miscommunication. And in fact, having no clear lines of communication in the balloon incident event, that was, I think, destabilizing because of the allegations that it was a spy balloon. It had observational equipment, and it was something that could not be directly discussed between the two countries because we had a lack of communication lines. And so that led into a broader conversation in that November 2023 engagement about sort of understanding each other's threat perceptions. We tried to, engage China in remembering the useful nature of our space security dialogues, our chem bio dialogues, and really focused on what we could do together to prevent risk. And one of the significant conversations was on missile launch notifications. China had not provided any missile launch notifications at that time for many decades. Although we know China has a missile launch notification agreement with Russia, and of course Russia and the U.S. are part of the Hague Code of Conduct, and we provide regular missile launch notifications both to each other through a 1988 agreement, but also we provide global missile launch notifications through the Hague Code of Conduct non-binding requirements. So we discussed at length with China why we thought these missile launch notifications were stabilizing. And it was useful because we were able then to see China provide the first missile launch notification in 44 years for a Pacific-facing missile launch of a ballistic missile. In September of 2024, they provided a missile launch notification to the U.S. and several Pacific partners, indicating that this was just a test, and it was something that was well received as a stabilizing risk reduction activity. And we very much hope that would continue. I think it will be hard now if China launches another Pacific-facing missile and does not provide such a missile launch notification. The implications could be that countries should assume it's not just a test. I think that would be extreme, but I think that there is an argument for how stabilizing it was to provide that launch notification and how well received it was that those type of launch notifications should continue. The other question I was asked, and I can talk more about the 2023 risk reduction engagement if folks are interested. The other question I was asked to answer, and I want to keep within my time, is what should the United States be seeking through nuclear policy talks with China? And I think the answer is what we have been seeking since the beginning of our P5 engagements. Preventing miscalculation, misunderstanding, and unintentional escalation is the broad goal, right? This confidence building measures, ways to prevent the misunderstanding that could lead to conflict, greater conflict, accidental or unintentional challenges and escalation. So we're looking to achieve some guardrails for the weapons programs, some agreement on responsible behaviors between us in terms of notifications and dialogue and communication capacity, so that if there's some confusing event, an accident, a clear miscalculation, there is some communication channels. We've had space communication channels, communications about outer space in the past that haven't been answered necessarily on the Chinese side when we've tried to inform them. Sometimes they are, but it's inconsistently responded to. And I think just making sure the communication channels we have with China are up and running and regularly manned, so that there's an ability to provide immediate contact and communication when needed. We're looking to understand each other's threat perceptions, understanding where our activities are deemed challenging for them, and where their activities are seen as a threat to us, so that we can avoid red lines that we're not intending to cross, that we may accidentally cross, such as if one of our satellites are targeted and either kinetically or non-kinetically, and that satellite happens to have some command and control capacity, that is a deep, deep red line for the US. And there may not be enough understanding of how our satellites are a part of our command and control system. These are the kind of risks that could happen without direct communication capacity. So I think that's what we should be trying to achieve, basic risk reduction. And we should work to address those arenas where we have shared threats, such as outer space and our extraordinarily important reliance on the outer space arena that both China and the US share. Confusion with respect to AI and its operation in both our strategic systems and even in our conventional, and trying to make sure we understand where risk reducing behavior and guardrails can be placed in that arena. Cyber, similarly, and whether we can have greater transparency on how to prevent bio threats to both countries. Finally, I think we should seek to have a trilateral or a P5 established strategic stability dialogue again. And even if that doesn't require outcomes, at least having everyone sit at the table to discuss common concerns, I think, would be useful. And really, my final point is just with respect to the testing concerns that we've heard again today, as Daryl pointed out. The answer cannot be just for all of us to resume testing. That doesn't achieve any risk reduction. In fact, it enhances the dangers inherent in nuclear testing alone, and also the risk of misunderstanding, miscalculation, and the capacity to develop these nuclear programs in arenas in which we've established the testing moratorium. And I think that would be highly destabilizing. The answer has to be, let's engage on how we prevent misunderstanding with respect to activities, how we show we're not testing going forward, engage in some support for what the CTBT hopes to achieve, and really establish that no testing is acceptable. Go back to the moratorium. The only country that stands to lose the greatest in a return to testing is the United States, as all of us on the panel have discussed before, because we have conducted the most tests, and the countries that need testing to improve their programs would stand to win from the walking away from the moratorium on nuclear testing. And happy to discuss that more. I think that was about 10 minutes, so I'll stop there. Daryl, I look forward to questions.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you for that laydown of past engagements. And just to kind of highlight a couple things that Mallory just said. So there was an attempt by the Trump administration in 2020 for a trilateral dialogue that did not get off the ground. China rejected that format, has more recently rejected that. But that does not appear to be necessarily what the Trump administration is proposing. They seem to have a more flexible, though still vague approach. And contrary to, I think, a lot of the conventional wisdom, there has been a bilateral dialogue that Mallory just discussed with the Chinese on nuclear matters in the past. It is my information is that the Trump administration has not yet, since January and Inauguration Day, proposed a bilateral dialogue with the Chinese quite yet. So there are many possibilities out there. Before I introduce our next panelist, let me just remind folks that if you have a question, and we'll be taking your questions and discussing them after the presentations, please post it in the Q&A function, and we'll get to those in the last part of today's event. So with that, let me just reintroduce Tong Zhao, who is one of the world's leading scholars and experts on helping understand China's nuclear policies and motivations. So it's very good to have you with us to hear from you your reflections and thoughts about how the US and China and other nuclear armed countries might engage on the significant and challenging nuclear arms control reduction issues before us, including, what you think China might be looking for out of an engagement with the United States and with other nuclear armed countries. So, Tong, thanks for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Daryl. It's such an honor to join this panel. Um, there were some guiding questions for my opening comments, so I'll try to follow those. Um, I think so far China has responded very explicitly to American proposals on China joining arms control talks with a very clear no. Um, and this position has been repeated for a few years. I think for China, the pressure from Washington can be ignored, but China has been paying more attention to the attitude of the international community. But on the latter case, I'm afraid that the international pressure is also decreasing, not least because um, what U.S. policy has done is to help uh, make the case for the Chinese narrative that in the international system, China is a power that is stabilizing, whereas the United States is becoming a much greater source of international instability. With what happened recently over, Venezuela, over Iran and other um, examples of U.S. foreign policy, including threat to Greenland, etc. I think some countries in the rest of the world might start to see China's overall military modernization, including perhaps even nuclear modernization, as a useful counterbalance against perceived American military aggression and geopolitical hegemonism. So, with international pressure on China to, immediately contain its nuclear growth declining, there is even less incentive for Beijing to respond proactively to American proposals. There are some interesting evolutions or changes in China's declaratory policies recently that may be worth noting. One is China, apparently in an effort to reassure international community, is putting out some more nuanced and specific formulations about how it tries to avoid joining a nuclear arms race. So the specific wording China now uses is China will not compete with the other nuclear countries on the spending of its nuclear uh, weapon program, on the scale of its nuclear weapon program, and on the numbers of its nuclear capabilities. Of course, there is some ambiguity over what's the relationship and difference between the term scale and numbers. There appears to be some overlap. Perhaps this is just my personal guess. Maybe the reference to scale might indicate types of nuclear weapons, but it is not very clear. But I think this is a Chinese effort um, to indicate that perhaps China has not made a decision to reach nuclear parity, especially in numerical terms, with US and Russia. And China tries to be more specific of what this means without breaking its opacity over its nuclear capabilities and future plans. And another interesting position is China is now calling on all nuclear weapon states to state publicly that they will not possess nuclear weapons forever. I think that's a useful statement reminding us that nuclear deterrence is a concept that is supposed to offer only a temporary solution to international security struggles. And I think it's harmless for other countries to consider this new statement that nuclear weapon states will not permanently possess nuclear weapons. Another interesting statement from China recently, I think this new position was adopted since the recent white paper released in November last year, in which it says China calls on nuclear weapon states to reach a legally binding document about comprehensively prohibit and thoroughly destroy nuclear weapons, right? A legal document on this. That's an interesting statement. What does it mean, right? Is China calling on others to do something that is somewhat related to the nuclear weapons ban treaty? How would this legally binding agreement look like? I think it offers some opportunities for international community, including the United States, to ask very important questions about Chinese thinking and plan on this. And also, another interesting development, although it is not completely new, but it has been China's position over the past 2-3 years, is China thinks regarding the issue of FMCT to ban the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons. China opposes a temporary moratorium on production of fissile material because of the lack of definition and scope and the difficulty to verify. So China thinks its practical usefulness is not very significant. But again, I think this is a relatively weak position in China's nuclear policy because China has a moratorium on nuclear testing, which means China does not necessarily oppose to similar commitments. So why China is so reluctant to even commit to a temporary moratorium on fissile material production? So it may be a disappointing policy move, but again, it offers opportunities for others to ask questions, including on the consistency of this policy with other similar policies China has adopted. Many people think going forward, nuclear risk reduction is a much more promising topic for arms control talks. And I think for China, there are two types of risk reduction issues that are interesting to Beijing. One is how do we understand the nuclear risks from emerging technologies, from various nuclear operational postures? I think China is very open to dialogues and discussions that aim at better understanding the risk. A second issue is I think China is interested in concrete measures to reduce risk only if China has certain control over how much China can allow to China has control over how much China actually implements such measures. For example, if there is a nuclear crisis hotline, China doesn't have to pick up the phone if China wants to send a political message. So that type of measure would give China certain control over what and to what extent China implements those measures. I think those controllable measures are preferable to Beijing than others. And in this case, I think it may be useful to consider talking with China about establishing a Chinese NERC, a National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, because there still lacks a 24/7 communication mechanism between US, China, or among all the P5 countries, in which it wouldn't require China to pick up the phone and offer immediate replies during crisis. It can allow China to receive emergency messages in a crisis, but it wouldn't put China under the pressure to immediately offer a response, given China's internal emphasis on concentration of power under the political leadership. Lower level government officials and military officials, they may feel very uncomfortable using a crisis communication to offer immediate response. So a NERC or similar type of communication mechanism might reduce that concern for China. When China looks at US increasingly planning to enhance America's own nuclear capabilities, I think some areas of US responses and future measures may be more concerning to China than others. I'm not that sure that Golden Dome or missile defense is the most concerning American development to Beijing, because many Chinese strategists are still watching to see how Golden Dome might actually materialize. And China has its own very ambitious program on missile defense. So China is also watching to see what technical lessons it can learn from Golden Dome. But there are two other issues I think are more concerning to Beijing. One is the increasing deployment of theater range missiles in East Asia, in places near China. And this includes America's development and potential deployment of medium range, intermediate range missiles, including land-based missiles to places near China. US allies' development of such missile systems in Japan, in South Korea, and Australia in the future. And secondly, the prospect that US might push for further forward deployment of nuclear weapon systems to the region, to East Asia. I think because China is particularly worried about these developments, maybe they would also offer some opportunities for arms control discussions on the issue of regional missile deployment. Perhaps China and other regional countries, Japan, South Korea, including the United States, can have a broad regional level discussion about joint restraint, or at least more transparency over regional missile development programs. China has long advocated for the principle of undiminished security for all. So when it comes to theater range missile deployment, how would China understand the implementation of such a principle that its regional missile systems shouldn't affect the legitimate security of other countries and vice versa. This might be a good starting point for a regional missile self-restraint mechanism. And on the second issue of Chinese concern about U.S. forward deployment of nuclear weapon systems, I think China certainly has a lot of dual-use missile systems, and it's uncertain how much of this is actually assigned a nuclear role. And there is concern in Beijing that U.S. might introduce dual-capable land-based missile systems to the region in the future, and China might also worry how much of these dual-capable missile systems will be made nuclear usable. So the mutual concerns over this issue might open opportunity for incentive to provide more clarity about both sides' dual-capable missile systems. Lastly, let me briefly answer the last question posed to me in the guidance, which is how might China respond to U.S. nuclear buildup? I think there is a small possibility. I don't think it is very likely, but there may be a small possibility that when China watches U.S. discussion of its own nuclear buildup, China may not necessarily mind America investing more resources into its nuclear capabilities. Because after China's own nuclear expansion, it is more confident about second strike. It doesn't see it is introducing extra significant threats to China if U.S. further strengthens its nuclear capabilities. In fact, with U.S. wasting resources into a capability that U.S. already possesses clear advantages that would make United States less able to invest in conventional deterrence and other high-tech capabilities. So China might be okay with U.S. nuclear spending imposing cost on the United States in an area that is not that important to the competition of overall deterrence. But more likely, I think, when China watches U.S. nuclear buildup, many people would automatically interpret this as a further indicator of U.S. aggression, which means it is more likely that Beijing will develop real concerns about it. How this will affect China's future nuclear response, I think it's useful to understand that China's nuclear need, firstly, is to secure a second strike, and that I think is more or less fulfilled. So the next question is how much China will develop escalation management capability, and whether American nuclear buildup will further incentivize those voices in PLA who want a more advanced nuclear escalation management capability. And once China embarks on that path of pursuing advanced escalation management, that's a very slippery slope because China may want to have the capability to respond in kind at every rung of the nuclear escalation ladder. But nothing would prevent China from wanting more, including dominance capability at every escalation level. I'm not saying the PLA is already doing that, but I think it's a very slippery slope, and hopefully U.S. future buildup wouldn't further provide talking points for those in PLA who might actually see military deterrence benefit in a more aggressive escalation management or escalation dominance capability. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive overview. Extremely helpful. Now we're going to hear from my colleague Tom Countryman about potential practical steps as I mentioned before, Presidents Trump and Xi are supposed to be meeting face to face more than once this year, which provides an opportunity. Um, there is the so-called P5 process, which has been going on for some time, right now at a low level, and we have the every 5 years Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference, month-long meeting that begins on April 27th, which is another potential opportunity for progress or a lack of progress. Tom, you've been involved in all these things. Your thoughts about how we can make some practical progress moving forward.
All right, thanks very much, Daryl. Let me start with a little bit of history going even before the part that Mallory spoke about. In the Obama administration, we had a strategic and economic dialogue between the U.S. and China, which came at a time when both sides were more sincerely interested in dialogue on a range of topics than they are today. And in that context, we did have some very general top-level discussions about arms control, non-proliferation, and related security issues. But even at that time, you could never be certain that the dialogue would continue. As a diplomat, I believe that you talk about issues even when it is difficult to do so and you are arguing about other things. But there is a long tradition in diplomacy that is overused, in my opinion, of suspending talks when you are annoyed at the other side. And this has been a staple of the Chinese approach going back to the Obama administration, canceling scheduled dialogues to express annoyance about the latest U.S. step on Taiwan, for example. And that continued through the Biden administration and up to today. Now, what could a Trump-Xi summit actually accomplish? Well, from the U.S. side, it's a little bit hard for me to be optimistic because while Trump and the State Department are correct that the expiration of New START allows for the possibility of a new era, of a new types of arms control, so far they have rhetoric, they have ideology, they have no plan that has been evident. And more importantly, they've not taken any of the steps that you would need to take to engage Russia and China and other nuclear states in such an effort. Undersecretary Donano's testimony this morning, given an opportunity to say that the U.S. had been proactive in talking to Russia and China, he was unable to say that. So until we get past ideology and rhetoric and to an actual idea from the U.S. communicated privately to Moscow and Beijing about how to get started, it will remain only in the ideological realm. That kind of fits with the way President Trump likes to do things. He puts great importance on personalized diplomacy, on his ability to convince other leaders to do what he wishes them to do. And in fact, that is how he has described his intention to bring China into a dialogue with the U.S., into a negotiation with the U.S. In my opinion, Mr. Trump's actual record of success in personalized diplomacy is thin at best. So what might we expect from a summit? I think on the U.S. side, you will see the president simply trying to make an argument to President Xi that you need to join these negotiations. And that would be the definition for Mr. Trump of success. I would hope that the Chinese side could take a more nuanced position, which is not to rule out the possibility in the future of multilateral negotiations, but instead to propose the kind of steps that might appeal to the U.S. president, and that would be important steps forward in a dialogue and toward such a negotiation. A few ideas for what China could propose. That would include, first, something about nuclear testing. To say to the president, we, China, did not conduct a test, but none of us want to conduct tests. So let's work out something. If it's not full ratification of the CTBT by both the US and China, what are the technical confidence building measures so that we can be assured among the five of us that nobody is testing? There are technical possibilities for such confidence building measures, as the United States in the previous administration suggested. What else could China propose to Mr. Trump? Well, something that I wish either China or the US would take the lead on, which is to say, let's start without so much formality and so much ambition. Let us start having a regular dialogue about security issues, not a capital level strategic dialogue where both sides have to write a detailed agenda first and have to make big, long press statements afterwards, but simply low-key, unpublicized, regular consultations that are not canceled whenever we annoy each other about tariffs or Taiwan or any other issue. They could agree, or again, either side could propose it at a US-China summit, that an intermediate step towards negotiation might be an agreement among the nuclear powers to freeze their current level of strategic launchers, not warheads, because that's a different, more difficult thing to count, but it would not be a barrier to the current modernization programs of the US or the increase for Russia and China to say we're going to freeze the level of strategic launchers. And that would be an important confidence building measure, and one relatively easy to achieve if either Beijing or Washington had the courage to propose it. There are other things that they could discuss as intermediate steps that build the momentum towards more meaningful strategic arms control negotiations. Tong has mentioned one of them. It would be valuable for all of the P5 to be connected with each other 24/7 through an arrangement such as the National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center that exists between Washington and Moscow. They could perhaps, agree at a summit to refer the questions about multilateral negotiations to the P5 process, but only if at the same time they say we are directing our representatives in this P5 process to be more ambitious, to meet more regularly, to focus on actual results. And the P5 process, there's a reference to this in one of the good questions in the chat, could evolve into the actual multilateral negotiation process. In fact, I think that is the hope of a number of non-nuclear weapon states when the P5 process began. But we have to be realistic. That would not be a rapid transition from a medium level consultation process to a defined negotiation process. There's no shortage of good ideas about how a Trump-Xi summit could move forward towards the kind of ending the arms race that the Chinese say they want, towards the strategic stability that the Russians say they want, towards the reduction of arsenals that the United States, Mr. Trump, says he wants. There are good ideas to get there. Sorry to close on a pessimistic note. but I'm not sure any of these things will come to pass in the coming months. First, because I see very little creativity or initiative in any of the three capitals, Washington, Moscow, or Beijing, to pursue new ideas. It's very much about scoring points in an eternal basketball game with no winners to see who can blame somebody else. Second, what I am concerned about is that the current political level of criticism of each other and blaming each other extends beyond normal political dialogue and has rather completely infected both the Conference on Disarmament, discussions at the United Nations, and increasingly is spilling over into the Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference starting a month from now. And the same dynamic, I think, has infected the P5 process as well. So while there is no shortage of good ideas, there is none of the three superpowers that are taking active steps to get us closer to such a meaningful negotiation. Thanks. I look forward to answering some of the questions.
Thank you, Tom. Ending on a difficult note is not something that's surprising these days, but that's where we are. I want to thank each of the panelists for some great opening presentations. We've got some very good questions, I think some of which may have been answered in the course of the presentation. Some may not have been. Tong, if you want to come back on screen, that would be great. I would like to start with one question for each of you, and consider this already a lightning round question. Try to be brief, but on the broad question of multilateral arms control, in theory, yes, all 5 of the nuclear armed states that are members of the NPT, the United States, Russia, China, France, Britain, have the obligation under Article 6 to engage in good faith negotiations on the cessation of the arms race and on disarmament. Up to this point, it has been the US and Russia that have been engaging in talks for 50 years on limiting and reducing their arsenals. What are some of the pros and the cons of a 5-party negotiation on these issues? Is it more complicated? I would imagine it is. The dynamics are more challenging. And so the question is, are there ways to have parallel bilateral negotiations, for instance, between the US and Russia, the US and China, that augment any kind of multilateral discussion or dialogue that is taking place between these countries? I mean, so your quick thoughts about some of the pros and cons of each of these formats from any perspective that you wish to share. So maybe Mallory, to start with you, and then Tong and Tom.
Sure. Thank you so much, Daryl. I mean, I think the key is that we should be open to trying anything that's going to accomplish some forward movement, because I deeply agree with Tom's point that there's actively nothing that seems to be being pushed right now by any of the P5 that actually can lead to risk reduction. So if that means in the multilateral arena with all of them, bilaterally, the concern I have is that we've seen historically, and including in this administration right now, a limitation on possible progress because one country is waiting for another country. So, for example, the U.S. disagreed. This administration said it didn't want to continue any discussions under sort of the architecture that New START had laid out, even if they were not politically binding, and certainly a challenge without having verification, because China wasn't part of it. So they were holding up any possible discussions until they could bring China in. And I think that's really harmful. I think this doesn't directly answer your questions, but it may give some framework for your question, which is, do not hold up a possible positive movement on risk reduction or risk mitigation, or even just any amount of confidence building because you're waiting for one of the other parties. Why not try it all? Try it in the P5, try it bilaterally, try it minilaterally, maybe have a US, China, UK, and France, have a US Russia, France, have a China, UK, and France without the US. Try anything. But the idea that we have to wait for all of the parties to get to the same place to make any progress, in my mind, is hugely unhelpful.
All right. Tong Zhao, your thoughts?
I think P5 is the preferred format for China for political reasons. It's really challenging to set unequal numerical quotas among the P5. Something like the Washington Naval Treaty, that's very unlikely. P5, a P5 strategic stability dialogue, on the other hand, I think is a very promising way to advance the discussion, basically to upgrade the current P5 process, perhaps to a higher level with a more explicit and stronger mandate. They can certainly address more substantively on emerging technologies, on setting red lines like no nuclear in space, etc. They can discuss a P5 NERC mechanism. The importance is how to make this process more responsive to international community concerns. And be held accountable in terms of making real and concrete progress. Another, I think, a potentially useful format is UK, France, China trilateral dialogue. They are all considered, second tier nuclear powers, different from the two nuclear superpowers. It might be a politically more acceptable format for Beijing. They can discuss their shared understandings of maintaining lowest level nuclear weapons for national security. So what that actually means today at the operational level, that could be a good topic for these three medium-sized nuclear powers.
Good. Tom.
Well, let me start with a sentence that all five governments would vigorously disagree with, and that is none of these five governments is currently meeting its Article 6 obligation to engage in good faith negotiations. Each of them has an excuse why it is somebody else's fault, but none of them is putting forward a proposal for how to move forward on good faith negotiations other than in social media posts. Historically, the United States and the Soviet Union, later the Russian Federation, made a number of important agreements because they did not pretend that any one agreement solved all strategic issues. They dealt with them one at a time. That is the opposite of what Beijing, Moscow, and Washington say today. They say so many things are interconnected that we have to have comprehensive agreements, and you can't just solve one problem at a time. That's one of the things that is holding us up today. I strongly agree with Mallory that we should pursue bilateral, trilateral, P5 processes, anything to move the ball forward on any single issue, large or small. I also agree with Tong that the P5 could do a hell of a lot more than it does today if the political leadership in five countries gave them the signal that the leadership wants this. I have to comment that, unfortunately, part of the Chinese approach to the P5, to the overall question of Article 6, is to say, oh, we have the P5 process, therefore we are meeting our legal obligation for negotiation, when they know, as well as the rest of us, that the P5 is not, at this point, a negotiating mechanism.
All right, thank you. We got a couple of questions about the potential for a U.S. increase in its number of deployed strategic weapons, which let me just answer this quickly. We have someone from near Bangor in Washington State, where the U.S. submarine launched ballistic missiles submarines are based. I mean, right now, there is $62 million that has been approved by Congress in its infinite wisdom for the uploading, or I should say the loading of additional submarine launched ballistic missiles on the Trident submarines in the tubes that were emptied to meet the New START limits. That will happen if the president directs the Navy to do so. The question is, will we find out about it? My humble answer would be we probably would, but there does not appear to be any legal barrier preventing the United States government from doing that. So, I mean, it underscores the fact that we are in a situation where there are no limits. It is possible for the United States to increase the number of deployed warheads. Russia would likely respond. You heard from Tong Zhao how the Chinese might interpret that. So until such time as there are serious negotiations underway that lead to some real results, we are going to be in this state of limbo in which we could see increases. There are a couple of questions I wanted to ask the panelists to answer, maybe starting with Tom, on the role of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference, what non-nuclear weapon states can do to help change the dynamics around let's call it the deficit in disarmament. Tom, you've been, on U.S. delegations at NPT conferences past. You've observed this. I mean, what in general can non-nuclear weapon states do to encourage the P5 to produce some better results?
Well, there's very little time before the conference begins next month, and I don't expect the P5 process to come up with something that will reassure all the non-nuclear weapon states. I am concerned that each of the P5 is working on their talking points meant to embarrass the others, criticize the others, and excuse their own rearmament and failure to implement Article 6. I think the best thing non-nuclear weapon states can do is not play that game, not to go in saying, well, the U.S. makes a better argument than Russia on nuclear issues, but to say clearly, all of the P5 are failing in their obligation. And to be more explicit, something that diplomats are unfortunately reluctant to do in the review conference, to be more explicit and say, we are concerned about China's growth in warheads. We are concerned about the U.S. policy on this. We are concerned about the Russian approach on this. It's only the five governments are going to measure their success at the review conference according to how much or how little they were criticized by name. And so the general approach of wringing hands and saying the five are not doing enough will not have an impact on any of the national governments. The only thing that will have an impact is if they are called out by names for activities that are inconsistent with the purposes of the treaty.
All right. Any other quick thoughts on this, Mallory or Tong Zhao, on the NPT RevCon?
Just that I completely agree with Tom that the name calling and finger pointing has turned into the whole game now, to the detriment of any forward progress on anything. It's how many times we really were highlighting how terrible we think our opponents are, and how many times we got mentioned as bad guys or not. And I think that, of course, misses the entire point. That said, I will say, having been in the US government, when all five are lumped together as bad actors, you lose a lot of the support from those in the United States in particular who felt that the United States, in reducing its nuclear arsenal by almost 90% since the Cold War, never got sufficient credit when other countries have been expanding and increasing their arsenal. And so there's this fine line between name calling and collectively lumping all together and actually acknowledging some of the previous activities that were done in a good way, but also saying now we have to do more. And that's where I think the NPT community has to really try to get to that point where it's most effective. And the P5 have to stop with the name calling, stop with the assertions that one has been doing good work. I mean, I think the US would fail in saying that the Russian nuclear saber rattling in the Ukraine context is unique now, when we've seen, even in some channels, suggestions that there is a turning to nuclear concerns or nuclear possibilities in an Iran conflict. There's definitely an inability for the US to claim now any type of sort of moral superiority. And I think people should put that aside and try to get to some actual progress.
All right, and I would just note on the NPT, Arms Control today just published an in-depth interview with Ambassador Do Hong Viet, who's the president of the review conference that will begin later this month. That is online. And I would just note that he said that it is his intention to bring states parties together on a final conference document that outlines common areas of support for the treaty, action steps to implement the principles and objectives. And he ended the interview by saying, without such an outcome, we may lose the credibility of the NPT itself and the review process. So this is an important meeting. We have that interview online at armscontrol.org. There are a couple other questions about the nuclear testing allegations, how to deal with them. Tom and Mallory addressed this, but I just wanted to, Tong, just give you a chance to just describe briefly how China has responded to the recent U.S. allegations of a Chinese nuclear test explosion on June 22nd, and what you think some positive ways going forward are to reinforce the global test moratorium.
Thank you. So the Chinese official response has been dismissing and saying the U.S. is creating excuse for its own resumption of nuclear testing. The Chinese expert community is not really discussing this issue because I don't think they really know. I mean, there are so few in the Chinese system who would really have the information about what happened or not happened. So there wasn't much discussion within the expert community. I think, a constructive way, if I may suggest, for Beijing to respond is to be more open to working with others in identifying the source of the seismic event that United States is accusing China of conducting on June the 22nd, 2020. If it was not a nuclear explosion, work with other governments or non-government organizations to jointly identify the source of that event. In a longer term scenario, China could also, I think, provide some more internal transparency, like what the NSA has done in previous years, inviting Chinese experts or some government affiliated non-governmental organizations to go to see the testing site to provide more information on the ground, give as an indirect way of providing more information of the overall operating status of the site, more clarification on the activities over there. It doesn't have to invite international observers, but even more internal transparency could, I think, be also very helpful, not least to informing Chinese experts about Chinese thinking and approach to CTBT and other nuclear modernization issues, so that we can have more useful and substantive discussions at the expert level.
All right, great. I would agree. And since the Arms Control Association held a virtual briefing about 3 months ago about the nuclear testing issue, there have been some developments. The U.S. accusations of a Chinese test. Let me just state for the record that the seismic data that has come back from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization from a station in eastern Kazakhstan has, I would say, been ambiguous about whether what happened on June 2020 was a nuclear test explosion. Other seismic stations in the region, only one registered this event. It was in China. It was part of a U.S. Geologic Survey network. It was also a very low signal, ambiguous about whether it was an explosion or an earthquake. I don't think we're going to get clarity from the seismic signals alone. The U.S. government probably has other information that is leading it to suggest that this was a explosion, but this is an issue that's not going to be settled with accusations or analyzing seismic signals. As each of you have said, the way forward is to pursue mutual, voluntary confidence-building measures to make sure that ongoing activities at test sites are not violations of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And there was one question about, do the P5 agree on what the CTB bans? Let me just also note, yes, there is agreement about what the CTBT bans: nuclear explosions, experiments that produce a self-sustaining chain reaction. That is the well-understood technical definition that the P5 and other CTBT states parties understand. And I would agree with what I think Mallory said, which is that nuclear testing on an equal basis by the U.S. makes no national security sense. Two nuclear wrongs don't make a right. And the NPT review conference will, going back to the NPT question, be a crucial opportunity for non-nuclear weapon states and the friends of the CTB to reinforce the need to reaffirm the global moratorium on nuclear testing and the CTBT. And I think that will be one of the likely major issues at the review conference. We have a couple other questions I wanted to get to, if we could, that go into a little bit more detail about some of the dialogue between the United States and China on certain, not necessarily nuclear weapons issues. There was a question about the discussions between President Xi and President Biden, and this is for you, Mallory, about the need for a human to remain in the loop regarding decisions about the employment of nuclear weapons. So if you could just tell us what you can about quickly how that came about and what might follow, because obviously that declaration is not necessarily enough to guard against, the ways in which AI might influence in a negative way crisis decision-making with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Daryl. So the Woodside statement was very positive. It was, we have agreed that there is a necessary commitment here, that there is a human in the decision-making loop with respect to strategic weapons. And that actually came about from various different conversations ending up in the White House after it had even been discussed at lower levels in various contexts, including the P5 discussion at the experts level, including we did not discuss it directly in our risk reduction discussion, but laying the groundwork for it in the communications leading up to that discussion, that then it went over to the White House and they continued it in advance of the Woodside Summit. I think it's a very positive step. The challenge is, where's the implementation? Where's the follow-on? What can we do with that now? And I think there is a huge potential here, given that China has released some AI policies, some AI guardrails in its own system. The US has not recently sort of engaged in that guardrail discussion. In fact, I think the most relevant recent activity may have been the executive order that Trump committed to upon his first month in office, saying that the AI regulations from the previous administration are not going to be continued. Now, Tom can address more of this, but I think this administration has been talking about things, but when they removed a control capacity from the U.S. states, putting it in the federal government control, and then didn't take any additional steps, I think there was a concern there. So hopefully there is some implementation emphasis and follow-on from that Woodside statement, but just left on its own with no follow-up, I think it actually can be challenging because people will think it's been addressed and we can move on. And I think that's the wrong way to treat it. So over to Tom.
I don't think I have anything to add on that topic, so I'll change the subject if I may. The first good question in the Q&A points to experts like Frank Miller and Eric Edelman, who I respect, who say that only an expansion of the U.S. arsenal and completion of the modernization program, that's the only thing that can bring China to the negotiating table. They may be right, but I think there is an assumption in the United States that, particularly in this administration and this Congress, that the supply of money for defense is infinite. The mythology lingers, and it's good mythology because it has a grain of truth, that the U.S. defense buildup in the 1980s is what drove the Soviet Union to disintegrate. And there are people who think that can be repeated today if we simply increase the defense budget so that it is twice as big as the rest of the world's defense budget combined. If we build a golden dome that will cost $175 billion this year, and potentially trillions if it is ever seen through to completion, that we can increase the current annual budget just for the nuclear weapons complex from $100 billion to more than that over a period of many years. And we can do all of that because the United States has infinite supply of money, or at least our grandchildren will be happy to pay off that debt. It is the opposite of the 1980s situation. China is better situated politically and economically to sustain a nuclear arms buildup and a military buildup than the United States is. I hate to say it, but it is an unfortunate fact. And for the U.S. to focus on spending money on nuclear programs at the expense of conventional defense, I think plays exactly into the hands of Chinese military planners. Thanks.
And of course, other nuclear armed countries have a vote, and they have the opportunity to increase their nuclear capabilities and numbers too, which then, of course, is the arms racing dynamic that we're concerned about in the absence of arms control. So let me just, we're approaching end of time here. We've got time for maybe one or two more questions. There are a couple of questions, Tong, about who is kind of running the show in China on these issues. If you could give us your best brief answer. I mean, we've been talking about, Mallory's interactions from the State Department with the MFA. Trump may be meeting with President Xi. There are military-to-military contacts. How is it, in brief, that China's nuclear policy is put together, and where are the key decisions made?
There is very, of course, official level information. My speculation is there must be some interagency process, perhaps at the National Security Commission or maybe the foreign ministry is taking the lead as the coordinator of this internal process. I think who calls the shot at the end of the day is the political level leadership. I'm not so sure that the operational level officials face a strong incentive to provide ambitious arms control options to the political leadership. And there might be strong veto players in the interagency process, especially after recent purges of senior military leaders. The ideas, non-traditional ideas like arms control, like self-restraint, uh, might be uh, might be less likely to be entertained by a military leadership that now is even more risk averse and more secretive, right? Less willing to expose internal thinkings and plannings to other agencies in the system and to the broader external expert community. So that's unfortunately not a very conducive internal environment for ambitious arms control ideas.
All right, thank you. All right, well, we're running out of time. I want to give each of our panelists a quick 30 or so seconds to offer any final comments before we wrap up. This has been a great discussion so far. Let me turn back to Mallory and then Tong and then Tom, and then we'll close out.
Thank you, Daryl. And thank you again for this conversation. I think the key is not to give up in any way. And I often hear that in this community and also in the deterrence arena, that there's no point in trying for risk reduction. We should just max out on deterrence. And that doesn't make any sense to me, because we can, regardless of your opinions of arms racing and your opinions of whether that concept is true or not, and I know there's some debate lately, we are in a cyclical reaction cycle that leads us to build up more and more in response to each other's activities, whatever you want to call it. There's no possibility of walking back from escalation and the resulting misunderstanding and miscalculation without some risk reduction activities, without some communication. The idea that Tom also mentioned, that in the policy arena, we look to solve every problem at once and not take piecemeal approaches and work with everything, and we restrain ourselves from actually possibly solving bit by bit because we wait for the entire package to come together. I think that's also hugely harmful. So if this community can work together to actually make progress in any way, shape, or form with any nuclear state towards risk reduction, towards nuclear risk reduction and prevention of unintentional escalations, I see that as a positive. And I think the NPT should inspire everyone to start being creative, start being forward-leaning, and not give up or be disheartened because we have ourselves recognize that the situation is getting worse, but rather make that inspire us to work harder. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Tong Zhao.
I think there's a real risk that in the thinking that U.S. could arms race and to compel China to come to the table. As Tom said, I think there is a possibility that China, sees it as a cost imposition on the American itself. China doesn't see the current U.S. nuclear capability as having any serious deterrence gap. Is still viewed as very strong. So it may benefit China if the U.S. with small resources on nuclear. And certainly China has confidence in building the United States in a cheaper and quicker way if necessary. I think what is important is for the nuclear powers to have more comprehensive and critical internal thinking on their future nuclear policies. There's a real risk that more countries would become more interested in developing capabilities for them to better control or manage nuclear escalation after nuclear first use. Instead, I think the geopolitical environment means, even for the United States, it is less politically um, uh, possible for U.S. President to deliberately escalate a conventional war to the nuclear level on behalf of U.S. friends and allies. So I think, in fact, conventional deterrence is going to be more important. The conditions for nuclear first use are diminishing. So this internal debate need to understand that it's for their own deterrence interest. Countries should make internal decisions to focus more on preventing nuclear use rather than managing escalation. And that can help break this historical pattern. Whenever a major power faces conventional inferiority, it shifts towards stronger reliance on nuclear weapons. I think we have an opportunity since the conventional balance is not very clear. The competition of which power will win at the conventional level is not very certain. So it's time to build that interest in breaking that historical pattern so we can really reduce the salience of nuclear weapons going forward.
All right, thank you. Tom, your thoughts?
Well, Tong just gave me a lot to think about, and instinctively I agree that conventional deterrence is key for U.S. allies, and I would like to see them think more about that than to wring their hands about whether or not the U.S. provides nuclear deterrence. I've been so pessimistic through this last hour that I'll try to finish optimistically. There are no doubt really well-qualified, smart people in the government, in Moscow and Beijing and Washington, who are capable of solving one issue at a time and slowing this rush towards an ever-accelerating arms race. They do not have the political backing of the three presidents to pursue smart solutions. They do not, as a result, they're not able to move forward on solving one issue at a time. How do you change that? How do you give political leaders an incentive to provide courage to the experts within their governments? Well, it's important for non-nuclear weapon states to continue to raise this, not just at the review conference, because I guarantee you the three presidents will not have any clue what is going on at the review conference. But when you meet with President Putin or President Xi or President Trump, if they start hearing it from friends and allies from all over the world, that may be able to bring about a change in the political direction, the liberation of their experts to pursue smart solutions. That's what we need to work on, both as civil society and as concerned non-nuclear weapon states. Thanks.
All right, thanks to the three of you. Thanks for that uplifting note at the end, Tom, about the charge that we have and our leaders have. Let me just thank each of you. Let me remind our viewers that this virtual briefing will be available recording on our website later this week. We at the Arms Control Association will have other resources, as we always do provide, on the NPT review conference, on discussions about multilateral arms control. Please take a look at Arms Control Today for that and more. We are a membership organization. Our work depends on the support of individuals and a few loyal foundations. So please, if you're not already a member, become one. If you find this virtual briefing helpful, sign up for our alerts. So we depend on you and we appreciate your time and attention. Thanks all. We are now adjourned. Goodbye. Good day.